In this video, I want to spend a few minutes talking about archaeology, that is biblical archaeology. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I believe that there really is too much weight on both sides in the biblical archaeological debate. There are those folks who try to use archaeology as a way to disprove the validity of Scripture, and then there are those who have used archaeology to try to prove the validity of Scripture. And I don't think really it's all that helpful. Partly because if the history of the Old Testament, and that's primarily what we're talking about, although I will spend a little bit of time talking about the New Testament, but the Old Testament has been written over the course of many centuries by many different writers. The New Testament was written during the course of 2 or 3 decades by much fewer writers. And so the controversies are generally around, can we trust the historical statements in the Old Testament in regards to archaeological discoveries? And there have been so many bogus claims over the years. The amount of money in ancient times that was made by transferring pieces of the cross, for example, I think is awful. The number of bones that rested in churches to validate God's hand on the churches, that's just gross in my view. Whether those bones are actual evidence or bones of saints or not, I don't get it. And there have been many claims made. I can't tell you how many times in the course of the decades that I have claimed to be a believer that I have read that Noah's Ark has been found. And I don't know, I've seen pictures, but I don't really believe that that's true. I think a bigger fuss would have been made if it was. I've seen, and there have been a lot of fake archaeological proofs. There was the ossuary of James, for example, that had the inscription, James, the son of Mary and Joseph and the brother of Jesus, and a huge fuss about, 20 years ago when this was discovered, maybe 10 years ago. And an ossuary is a place where the first century Jews would collect the bones of people that they revered when their body had deteriorated, and it was an ancient Hebrew practice. And so a big fuss was made about this. And in fact, I've got a book on my shelf about it. But sure enough, a few years ago, they determined that the writing on it was really pretty current. And of course, even if it was ancient, Joseph and Mary and Jesus in the Jewish world were common names. So, Jesus was the same as Joshua in Hebrew. Actually comes from the actual Hebrew word Yeshua, which can be rendered either way. So even if there was proof, what does that really say? It could have been somebody else. And of course, the Shroud of Turin, that imprint was proven to have come from the Middle Ages. And so there have been lots of relics, lots of so-called archaeological proofs over the years that Christians have clung to that have turned out to be bogus. And so when I talk about archaeological biblical evidence, I don't know, I'm pretty skeptical of it. I think well-thinking Christians ought to be. However, there have been discoveries made that have validated some of the events of Scripture that theologians or historians or archaeologists were surprised about. The Pool of Bethesda, for example, was deemed to have been made up in the New Testament, and and this is found in the Gospels, where people would, go to this pool for its healing properties. But recently there really was evidence of it that was uncovered. And that says nothing whatsoever about the deity of Christ, but it can be somewhat comforting to, okay, there was something here that the New Testament mentions. And the same thing can be said about the census that Mary and Joseph were required to go to, which is the claim or the reason why Luke says that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and not in Nazareth, where Joseph and Mary were living. Luke's claim, and Luke was an historian. If you look at the Greek, Luke's writing exudes an educated person putting this together. And Luke is probably, he's the only Gentile that we know of to write a gospel. A Gentile is a non-Jewish person, and, Jewish ancient thinking, probably current thinking, but I'm not sure that they really break it up quite black and white these days. But at any rate, he was by all accounts, a Gentile who was converted to Christianity, and he was he was a physician, a doctor, and an historian. And he was hired by a rich man, Theophilus, to write down an historical account of Jesus and an historical account of the early church. And so he wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he wrote the book of Acts. And he was an historian. Part of his history was eyewitness history. That is, there was some period in which he did experience some of Paul's missionary journeys with Paul. In the account, it goes from a they to a we. But for the most part, it was all research. For the most part, he interviewed the people that were around Jesus' birth, which is why he is the only gospel writer to give a detailed account. And around Jesus' birth, Luke claims that Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem because they were from the house of David, and Bethlehem was the city of David, small village outside Jerusalem, in order to participate in the census for the Roman Empire. And for many, many, many years, up until the late 19th century, critical scholars assumed that was made up, and that at the time of Jesus' birth, they were not doing a census for the empire. That was not a part of early first century living. And but it wasn't until late 19th century, early 20th century that they actually found evidence to support that was a regular occurring event. They found a papyrus in Egypt that actually spelled out in detail how it was done. And Luke says that it was done during the government of Quirinius. And critical biblical scholars have contended that there is no evidence that there was any governor with that name during the time that Jesus was born. But recent archaeological evidence confirms that there actually was. So every once in a while you find little tidbits, little evidence that gives us some assurance that what we read in the Old Testament and the New Testament correlates with actual historical events. So I mention that, but once again, I don't give it the same sort of weight as I give the other evidence that I have talked about. But I did want to include a short little blurb in this series about that, because there's lots of arguments about it, and there's lots of people who hang their hats either way on what they consider to be accurate historical evidence. I don't, for example, really believe that the Ark of the Covenant is hidden in Ethiopia, but there are many, many Christian people who do, and that makes them convinced that the Old Testament renditions of the Ark of the Covenant are true. So I mention archaeological evidence with a very cautious caveat. Next video, I would like to talk about contemporaneous historical figures that bear out the life of Christ as it is described in the Gospels, and then we will draw this series to a close. Thank you.